So today in part two, we're going to build on that with this third question. In fact, the case for God is significantly strengthened, I think, when we look at the evidence regarding what happens after we die. So let's get right to that. I hope you find this as fascinating as I do. Now, a conversation about what happens after we die can gain momentum pretty quickly because everybody has thought about this, and almost everybody has a theory about whether there is life after death. In fact, it's been that way throughout history. A lot of theorizing. The ancient Greeks and Egyptians, for example, believed that a person's deeds were weighed after death, the good and the bad, and as a result, we get a reward or some sort of punishment. For many of the Eastern religions, the answer to what happens after we die has long been a cycle of reincarnation. For atheists, they suggest it's just game over, right? No next level, no replays. The Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they all anticipate some sort of final destination determined by either grace or works, depending on the faith tradition. And there are many, many more belief systems, right? A lot of theorizing out there. But the point is this: envisioning eternity has always been part of the human condition. Envisioning eternity has always been part of the human condition. And you could call that a metaphysical mystery and one of the recurring questions in every culture. So anyone you talk to about this is likely to have an opinion. Often for the skeptic, one who's atheistic or agnostic, or one who claims to have no spiritual beliefs at all. That's a large and increasing segment of society. Often for the skeptic, that opinion might be something like this. Say, hey, there's a fatal flaw in all these life after death theories. Fatal flaw. You see what I did there? You got to allow me at least one dad joke on Father's Day, okay? There's a fatal flaw in all these life after death theories. No objective evidence to support any of them, right? No evidence of an afterlife, no evidence of a God there, just conjecture, just wishful thinking. It's an understandable objection, too. Right? This side of the Enlightenment, we prefer data to dogma, verifiable evidence, not just your word for it, not just the word of some alleged holy book, not just your centuries of tradition, not just you got to have faith. In the 21st century, many people want hard evidence before they accept something, and especially something that touches their worldview. So what do we do with that? Well, I'd say start where they are. Give them the evidence. I'm here today to tell you that there does happen to be some data, some objective and even verifiable evidence that implies the existence of both an afterlife and a God who is in charge of it all. Data. What data are we talking about here? Well, there is a surprisingly credible case emerging from people who claim to be actual eyewitnesses to this afterlife. And eyewitnesses to the God whom they claim they met there. People whose hearts stopped, people whose brainwaves flattened, but who later returned to life. It's a case from so-called near-death experiences. And during the past 50 years, it's gained more credibility than you might realize. In the next few minutes, I'm going to unpack that case as another possible answer to this question: does God exist? And I invite you to keep in mind that this is a data-driven, evidence-based answer that fits the worldview and demands of many skeptics. Maybe many of the skeptics in your life, or maybe the skeptic in your mirror. All right, so let's take a look at that case, starting with defining our terms to be clear what we're talking about here. Okay, by near-death experience, which I'm sometimes going to abbreviate as NDE in this talk, we simply mean events that take place as a person is dying or indeed already clinically dead. And that's a standard definition from the research. And a standard finding from the research is that reports of NDEs transcend generations and cultures and belief systems. And the reports come from everywhere. Typical is this quote from a 28-year-old woman who said, after a particularly blissful near-death experience, she said, "I was always a professed atheist, but after my experience, I know there is a God. He was waiting for me at the end of the tunnel. I felt a peace and tranquility I had never known. I find it very reassuring now because I know our spirit does outlive our body." Another described his experience like this: if you took the 1,000 best things in your life and multiplied by 1,000,000, maybe you could get close to this feeling. Maybe. At the very least, it seems like it's worth looking into, right? Now, the many, many detractors, and maybe you are among them, see these near-death experiences as comparable to alien abduction or ghost sightings or the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot or something like that. They explain them away by calling them dreams or hallucinations or reactions to anesthesia, or perhaps they're just the natural result of a dying brain. And some of these critics are very smart people. They're medical people. They're doctors. They are psychiatrists. Well, are they right? Well, let's look at the evidence, and you can judge for yourself. Well, let's call this Exhibit 1 here. All right, the prevalence and pattern of near-death experiences. What does that mean? Well, people all over the world have reported taking one of these out-of-body journeys when their physical body went into cardiac arrest, during a medical operation, or maybe after a car accident, or when they were drowning, any number of contexts. How many people are we talking about? Well, the Gallup organization a few decades ago estimated this at 8 million people in the United States alone. And at that time, it was about 1 in 30 people in this country. More recent studies in the US and Europe put that number at about 1 in 25. About 4% of the population. But whatever the actual number of near-death experiences, it's estimated to be in the millions in the United States and seemingly in the hundreds of millions around the world. That's the prevalence part of this. Right? Apparently, this is a fairly common occurrence and likely becoming more common with every new life-saving technique that brings people back from the brink. But the really curious thing about these journey reports isn't just how many there are or how global they are, but how consistent they are. Right? Many of these accounts feature the same core elements, and no doubt you've heard of some of these, things like seeing their body from above, or moving through a tunnel, an encounter with a being of light, or the feelings of perfect peace and unconditional love, meeting other spiritual beings, angels, deceased loved ones, walking through a place of indescribable beauty, or sometimes reaching a boundary or point of no return, and then returning to their body, often involuntarily. We've heard of some of these things. Also, this pattern appears to be consistent in studies of children's NDEs. And even the blind have reported many of these same elements from their near-death experiences. Now, that's significant in social science research when these kinds of populations offer consistent testimony. One researcher claims to have the largest data set of NDEs in the world at more than 4,000 cases, concludes that indeed some of these elements seem to be universal. In other words, similar regardless of the experiencer's age or cultural beliefs, education, or geographic location. Now, here's the question. In light of all of that, how likely is it that so many of these experiences would unfold in a similar and logical order if they were simply dreams or hallucinations? Now, what are the chances of something like this? From an evidential standpoint, it seems pretty implausible. So that's one line of evidence, right? This prevalence and consistent pattern of near-death reports. It's what we would call preliminary evidence that these near-death experiences might be real. Right? At the same time, it's no way conclusive. So what else do we have? What else is there? Well, Exhibit 2. The changed lives of people who report having a near-death experience. Now, people who go through these experiences usually come back changed, different somehow. Most of them no longer fear death because they're confident they know what's next. And many of them no longer fear life. They begin taking more risks, more chances. They start enjoying life to the fullest. Plus, there are countless stories of people whose lives turned around completely after their near-death experience. Let me give you 2 quick illustrations of this. A man named Paul Ojeda overdosed on cocaine and it led to a near-death experience where he fell deeper and deeper into a black tunnel. Paul believed that he was on his way to hell, and he thought, I'm a good person. I shouldn't be going here. But the situation was obviously hopeless, so he cried out, please, Lord, I don't want to go to this place. Please save me. Paul says that he suddenly had this unmistakable sense that God was there with him, asking Paul, what have you done with the life that I've given to you? God then replayed Paul's entire life in front of him, which made it clear that Paul had done nothing meaningful with his 30 years. After waking up in the hospital, Paul vowed to, quote, find the God who pulled me out of hell. And apparently he did find this God because Paul Ojeda, now Pastor Ojeda, currently leads one of the largest churches in Austin, Texas. It's a total 180. Something similar happened to a man named Howard Storm. Storm, S-T-O-R-M. This is not Howard Stern. We're kind of waiting on him whether this happens. But Howard Storm was an art professor and an atheist. In his near-death experience, some figures lured him from his hospital bed down this corridor that got increasingly dark. At some point, these figures turned on Howard and attacked him and tore at his skin and bit him and left him in what he says was level 10 pain from head to toe. Howard then claims to have heard a voice saying, pray to God. He thought, I don't believe in God. But he was willing to try anything at that point to end the torture. The best he could come up with, and I had to write down this prayer so you wouldn't miss a word. It'd been a while for Howard. Best he could come up with was, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, for purple mountain majesties, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. One nation under God, God bless America. Not exactly the Lord's Prayer, not exactly the sinner's prayer, but genuine. All right, so genuine, in fact, that these creatures became profane and immediately retreated. And in desperation, Howard cried out, Jesus, save me. Then Howard claims Jesus entered as light into that dark place and picked him up and hugged him and healed his wounds and took him rapidly upward. Howard says that the joy and the love that he felt were so indescribable that after that experience, he too relinquished his former life to become a pastor. Was your call to ministry this dramatic? Certainly mine wasn't. It doesn't always end in conversion, and certainly doesn't always end with someone joining the clergy, but it did for Paul and for Howard. And as you see, not all of these events are blissful. All right, some people report hellish near-death experiences that are uniquely distressing. Researchers estimate that at about 15 to 20% of these events, and these people are even more likely to turn their lives around. Maybe not a surprise there. Now, if you're thinking that changed lives aren't really proof of anything, well, you're right about that. But the second line of evidence simply shows that whatever these experiences are, they're real enough to create total transformation in people's lives. Damascus Road-like changes in people's worldview, which is what we'd expect if these experiences actually reflect reality. So the plot thickens. What else do we know? So Exhibit 3, call it the corroborated evidence. Now, so far, we've highlighted the prevalence and consistent pattern of these reports, plus the changed lives after an NDE, and all that's what we might consider preliminary or prima facie evidence. But this third line of evidence gets us much closer to what we would call proof. Right? It's the corroborated evidence for life after death experiences. Corroborated meaning that the claims these people made about their experience were verified by others as accurate. Okay, how can that be when no one else was there during this alleged experience? Well, sometimes the corroboration looks like this. Sometimes it's an accurate report from this person about what happened in the operating room during their surgery while they were incapacitated. I mean, no reason at all that they should know the details of who was there or specific medical procedures or that the nurse was wearing plaid shoelaces, but somehow they did know these things. Sometimes the corroboration is an accurate report about events further away from where the person was dying, someplace else in the hospital, or maybe outside of it, or even miles away. Again, it's inexplicable how they would know these things. And occasionally it comes in the form of reporting accurate information about deceased persons that they say they met in the afterlife. Remember, the difference in these accounts and what makes people take them seriously is that there is corroboration of the claim. Just like in a court of law when some witness's story checks out as true. Now, some examples will help clarify this. I'll share a few of the better-known stories in each of these categories, but recognize there are now hundreds of NDE reports that have been corroborated, making them increasingly difficult to ignore. One of the more famous stories comes from a journal called The Lancet, which is probably the top medical journal in Europe. Patient was brought into a hospital in Holland, unresponsive and not breathing. Medical staff removed his dentures to insert a ventilation tube, and they put the dentures in the drawer of a nearby crash cart. A few days later, the man regains consciousness, and he was told by the staff, "We kind of lost your dentures in the chaos of the moment." But the patient, claiming to have seen all of these events from above, said he knew exactly where the dentures were, and he even identified the nurse who put them in that crash cart. The article went on to say, quote, "He was also able to describe correctly and in detail the small room in which he had been resuscitated, as well as the appearance of those present, despite having been in a deep coma and in the process of CPR at the time." Again, this is a major medical journal, not the National Enquirer. All right? Here's another peculiar account. Woman awoke from a coma claiming to have floated over her body when the medical staff was working on her. Nurses kind of rolled their eyes. They'd heard these stories before, always dismissed them as dreams or brain malfunctions or something like that. But this patient told the nurses that during her out-of-body experience, she saw and memorized a 12-digit serial number that was on top of the respirator. Okay. They indulged her, and they wrote this down. So this respirator machine is 7 feet high. All right, so they call for a maintenance man to check on top of it. The guy shows up with a ladder. They said, "Is there a number on top of that machine?" Yeah, there is. Happened to be the exact 12-digit number that she had given to the nurses. I mean, it's just crazy, jaw-dropping stuff. These stories, the dentures and the 12-digit number, they're from this first category of corroborated evidence. The second category, probably the most circulated report, comes out of Seattle. There was a woman who was resuscitated in the hospital after having a heart attack, and she insisted that she saw a sneaker on the third-floor window ledge of the hospital as her consciousness floated upward. And she got very detailed about it. She described it as a man's left sneaker, dark blue, with a wear mark over the little toe region, and the shoelace tucked underneath the heel. And as it turns out, she was exactly right. The nurse who eventually found the sneaker, her name is Kimberly Clark Sharp, and she's retold this story many times, said that, quote, "The only way she could have had such a perspective was if she had been floating right outside at very close range to the tennis shoe. I retrieved the shoe and brought it back." And then there's this third category of corroborated evidence, reports from deceased persons that they claim to have met in the afterlife. And these can be even more astonishing. Just a couple here. A guy named Jack Bybee was hospitalized for severe pneumonia in South Africa. And one of the nurses who was attending to him was a 21-year-old named Anita. Now, in Jack's near-death experience, Anita was there telling him he must return to his body. And yeah, I get it. It sounds like this guy's dreaming about his 21-year-old nurse, but hang on, there's more here. Anita also told Jack in this experience to please tell her parents that she was sorry that she wrecked the red MGB, and she loved them very much. An MGB is an old British sports car, 2-seat convertible. Now, when Jack awoke, he told one of the nurses what he had experienced, and this nurse burst out into tears and ran out of the room. See, unbeknownst to Jack, Nurse Anita had just been gifted a red MGB by her parents, and on her first drive, she crashed into a concrete pole and died. Here's one more from Holland. A 5-year-old girl contracted meningitis, fell into a coma, had a near-death experience where another little girl hugged her and said, "I'm your sister. I died a month after I was born. Our parents called me Reja," a Dutch name. And when she awoke, the girl told her parents about what her, quote, angel sister had said. The parents had to leave the room to compose themselves because, as it turned out, they had, in fact, lost a daughter named Reja to poisoning a year before their other daughter was born, but they had never told her. She was too young for that. And actually, that story might sound a little bit familiar to you because it bears a striking resemblance to one you might have heard before, the American case of Colton Burpo, whose near-death experience was retold in the bestseller and the film, Heaven is for Real. Following his brush with death, 4-year-old Colton casually mentioned to his parents that he had met his other sister in heaven, a girl who looked like his sister at home but had darker hair. This girl in heaven allegedly told Colton that she had died in their, quote, mommy's tummy, and she was excited for the family to join her. It was a staggering moment for Colton's parents, who indeed had a miscarriage but had never revealed that to their young children. Okay, well, hopefully you get the idea here. As you'd imagine, these corroborated reports present a significant challenge to those who claim and insist that NDEs are mere dreams or drug reactions or something along those lines. In each of these cases, the person returned with accurate information that they simply should not have known. In fact, one of the leading researchers, NDE researchers, puts it this way, and is a little bit academic, but stay with it. It's an important quote. Gary Habermas writes, "No matter what subjective internal states the critics wish to discuss," translation, no matter the suggestion that it's all in their head, "by their very nature, the critics cannot explain the existence of objective, externally corroborated NDEs, like the ones that we just shared here. The available evidence for NDEs seems clearly to be more than enough to establish their evidential reality." Plainer English, Professor Habermas is asserting that the corroborated stories completely defeat the argument that NDEs are not real. Okay, that is a very brief outline of the case for near-death experiences, and as I mentioned, it may be stronger than many people realize. And if you want to dig deeper, there are certainly plenty of books out there. Your handout identifies some of the better-known works, the academic works, and the popular press works, as well as some of my recent work in this field. But to be clear, the evidence is certainly not beyond a reasonable doubt. All right, it really has not risen to that standard of proof, not to that level. What we can say with integrity, I think, is that the prevalence and consistent pattern of near-death experiences, plus the changed lives afterward, plus the mounting corroborated evidence, is clearly making it more likely than not that at least some of these experiences are real, that they're actual eyewitness accounts of what happens when our body shuts down. It's increasingly difficult to escape this conclusion. Now, what does it all mean? At least three important implications as we wind this down. First, the NDE evidence implies that there is indeed a supernatural realm, not just a natural one. In other words, there's evidence here for another world, a world beyond our own, contrary to the atheist position, a supernatural world. Second, the NDE evidence implies that our consciousness survives physical death. As so many have speculated throughout history, and as the last 50 years of social science data indicate, there really is an afterlife for human beings, possibly with multiple destinations, one glorious and one ghastly. Death, it seems, is a doorway. And third, with regard to the question of God's existence, in testimony after testimony, people describe meeting a supreme being of light who communicated absolute, unconditional love and acceptance. In fact, this is one of the most consistent elements of NDEs from the earliest studies all the way through the present day. We get eyewitness evidence here, not only that there is a God, but about the nature of that God, what God is really like, a God who loves you more than you could possibly imagine. And take the 1,000 best things in your life, put them all together, multiply by 1,000,000. And that's how much God loves you. So the NDE evidence may reveal both the existence of God and the nature of God. Could anything be more profound? Okay, wrapping up these 2 weeks. If someone were to ask, does God really exist? Or if someone were to assert or even imply that God does not exist, what can you say? We've suggested resisting the temptation to give an immediate answer and instead open up a dialogue that explores questions like, where did we come from? How should we live? What happens after we die? Then through that dialogue, introduce them to the evidence for God from the logic and from the science, as we showed last time, as well as from the eyewitness testimony that we've been talking about this time, right? Perhaps especially the eyewitness testimony. Why especially? Well, because many people find near-death experiences far more interesting and even far more credible and compelling than arguments about a first cause or the design of the universe or where morality comes from. Indeed, near-death experiences may become the ultimate apologetic. In fact, over time, NDEs may spell the END of atheism. Now, that's probably an overstatement because no one can prove God with 100% certainty, and perhaps that's by divine design. But collectively, through your conversations with your skeptical friend or family member, maybe that can illustrate the reasonableness of believing in God and the abject unreasonableness of disbelief. Bottom line, friends, the atheistic position has become the weaker position, and that's without even referencing the Bible. May God grant us all the opportunities and the wisdom to help others to know him.